Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the SaferSpaces webinar series. We're now on webinar number 4, and this is all in relation to South Africa's white paper on safety and security and how do we take that particular document, which has been around since 2016, forward. And so what we're doing today, and my name is Guy Lamb, I'm the Director of the Safety and Violence Initiative at the University of Cape Town, is through SaferSpaces, which you all may be aware of, is an online platform of violence prevention, crime prevention practitioners and organizations. We're trying to make SaferSpaces a lot more active, a lot more interactive and a lot more relevant to debate. So we've started this year with a series of webinars, and we have webinars every week on a Friday. And as I say, this is our 4th webinar. And the focus of today is on gender-based violence prevention, intersections and collaboration. And we're going to be continuing with these webinars on a weekly basis into April and possibly even May. At the moment, we've also been building up quite a lot of interest in them. We started with a small group of people with our first one, and I see now we're getting into the 30s for this one. So I'd like to welcome you all here today. We have up until 2 o'clock for this particular session, and we have 2 speakers. So I'd also just like to indicate that SaferSpaces is a partnership between a large number of civil society, research-based university organizations working on violence prevention, crime prevention, that's working in collaboration with the Civilian Secretariat for Police Services on the implementation of the White Paper on Safety and Security, and funding is generously provided by the Violence and Crime Prevention Program with GIZ. So without any further ado, I'd like to get the webinar started. We have 2 speakers today. We've got Professor Shanaaz Mathews, who is the director of the Children's Institute. She was before joining UCT in 2012, she was with the Medical Research Council, and for many, many years, Shanaaz has been working on gender-based violence-related issues, violence against women, violence against children in particular. So Professor Mathews will be speaking first. And then we have Felix Bwalya, please excuse my pronunciation if I've got it wrong, Felix. And Felix is from Partners for Prevention and Partnerships for Prevention, my apologies. And so each of you has around 20 minutes to present. There's only 2 speakers today, so we have a bit of a luxury with time, but around 20 minutes to speak. And then what we're going to do is open up for discussion after that, after both of your presentations, and we can have comments and discussion and questions after that. So let me at this point in time invite Shanaaz if you'd like to start your presentation, and you have about 20 minutes or so. So over to you, Shanaaz. Let me just, okay, you're sharing your screen. Okay, it's
Can you
working
see
for me.
my screen, Guy?
I can see your screen.
Okay, so I'll go into presenter mode then.
Fantastic.
I'm working on 2 screens, so it's taking a time to show. So you're able to see it on your side?
I can see it from my side. I can see it clearly from my side.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Savvy for inviting me to present at this afternoon's seminar. I presented a very similar talk last year, and I'm drawing on that. There's some tweaks to it, and so for those of you that joined us on a webinar series last year, which we hosted in September to October, I apologize because there's some repetition in this, but I'm sure, you know, as with every presentation, it's never the same. So I'm drawing on a piece of work that I'm going to be presenting to you this afternoon, is really to start thinking about, if we're talking about reducing or preventing violence against women and children, what I've been involved in and thinking about for quite a while now is to start thinking about, so why have we been working in very separate ways of, you know, for the past many years, and how can we start thinking about joint programming? So this afternoon I want to ask, why does it really matter, and why do we need to start thinking about it as intersecting forms of violence? I want to start by saying that we're all familiar that both violence against women and violence against children are quite endemic in society. And when you start looking at the levels of violence, particularly in countries across Africa and in South Africa, we are certainly seeing that levels of violence are higher than in other regions. So if we look at South Africa, we know from the work done by the South African Medical Research Council that about 1 in 2 women have experienced physical and sexual IPV in their lifetime. Similarly, when you start looking at children, we know that between 35 and 45% of children have experienced violence in the home. And when you start looking at experiences of violence, both in the home and communities for children, it's much higher. I was part of a group that did an analysis of the birth to 20 cohort, which is children born in 1990 in Soweto, and we've been following them up for nearly 30 years now, and looking at experiences over their life course. And if you look at cumulative experiences of children, and that particular birth cohort, who is about 4,000 children born in the year 1990, we see that about 99% of children in that birth cohort have either experienced or been exposed to some form of violence. And that's enormous if you take that into account. And I want you to bear that in mind as we talk about the violence across. So I think it's really important to see violence not just as a once-off event, but that violence occurs across the life course of a person. And you see different forms of violence, and therefore it's really important to understand that violence is not once off, and that we have to take into account the various forms of violence that children experience and later in adulthood can drive experiences in adulthood, and therefore the cumulative effects of violence are really important. It started emerging across the globe probably about not even a decade ago, but about 5 years ago. There's been an interest to start thinking about what are the intersections between violence against women and violence against children. And work done by Emma Fulu and her colleagues looking at a large multi-country study in Asia and the Pacific have highlighted some of these intersections. And what we see and what has emerged out of their work is that there's certainly violence against women and violence against children are underpinned by shared risk factors. They're also driven by very common forms of social norms, but most importantly, that they co-occur within the same household and drive an intergenerational cycle of violence. And therefore it becomes critically important for us to understand these intersections in order for us to also start thinking about how our programming can have increased impact as well as better outcomes for both women and children. Just want to say that, and I'm not going to go into detail, but what we are doing here is that I'm presenting data from what we have done as a scoping review, and looking at intersections of violence against women and children, particularly on the African continent, and then starting to also think about what do we know about interventions to reduce both forms of violence. And the review, I'm not going to go into very detailed description around the methodology, but just to say what I'm presenting today is drawing on a scoping review data. The guiding framework for our review was underpinned by the work of Alessandra Guedes, who had first explored these intersections in 2016 and highlighted some of these, and these form the framework of what we then explored. So if we start looking at these intersections, what we do see is that, as I've mentioned in my introduction, is that co-occur in the same household. And what underpins this co-occurrence of violence against women and violence against children is that they're certainly driven by shared risk factors, and we'll unpack this next, as well as what we see as common social norms, that similar social norms drive them. So what we understand by this is that children coming from violent households are certainly at greater risk of experiencing violence as well as perpetrating violence. And what we understand by that also is that we do see a gender dimension with that, where girls are at increased risk for victimization later on, particularly in the form of intimate partner violence, while young men and boys who are exposed during childhood, particularly to intimate partner violence, are at increased risk themselves of becoming perpetrators of intimate partner violence. And therefore, what we do see is that violence against women and violence against children mutually reinforce one another. Just to illustrate what I'm saying here is, I did work with men in prison so I did research with them, trying to understand, these are very violent men who had killed an intimate partner, and wanted to understand what in their, what drive and what within their social context allow men to become as violent as this. And here, a 45-year-old man explained to me, and he spoke, because it wasn't, I explored their whole history, and within that he explains a bit about his childhood, and he explained violence within his own family, how he tried to intervene when his father was abusing his mother, and as a consequence he himself was beaten. And he talks about how he felt depressed, and as a result, what we do see is he felt that it impacted firstly on his feelings of safety. It exacerbated his feelings of powerlessness as a child within that household, and the repeated painful experiences then that he experienced as a child. When we explored later his adult life, what we found was that and we can explain it by being internalized and affected his own interpersonal relationships later on. So when we start thinking about the common risk factors that underpin both violence against women and children, we certainly see that gender inequality drives the power dynamics between adults and children and creates the possibility and in fact allows violence to occur without it being questioned. We also know that male dominance underpins this controlling behavior that drives violence in the home, that's not just directed at women but also at children. Partner conflict, we also see it being associated with an increased risk for intimate partner violence, but this also increases the risk for children to experience emotional abuse, particularly if they are not physically abused themselves. They're also at increased risk for physical and sexual violence. Combined to all of this is that of harmful alcohol and drug abuse as well, which is associated with an increased risk of IPV, but we also know in the South African context that certainly the use of alcohol and drugs increases the risk of child abuse. So this is just to show you from the work that Guy and I have done together on the determinants of violence against women and children, and this is just the one part of our model that clearly shows that if you start thinking about how children, let me just go back, how children, what increases the risk of for children and the risk for violence, what we certainly see is that conflict in the household has direct effects on children's increased risk for both emotional and physical abuse. What we also see in this model is that the presence of parents in the household, where there's one or both parents not present in the household, there's an increased risk for children to be exposed to drugs and alcohol in the household, as well as someone in the household who's been exposed, who is involved in crime. And this also increases risks for both emotional and then later physical abuse. Gender and being a female child increases risk, is just an increased risk overall. And this starts explaining some of what we see. But what we also know by work done by the Medical Research Council, we see a direct relationship between experiences of child abuse. So if you look at this, you see that where there's a history of child abuse and measured by the childhood trauma scale, we see that for women, there's an increased risk of IPV, that 86% of women had experienced IPV. We also see that for men, there is an increased risk for being physically abusive, for being physically abused as a child, neglected as a child, and emotionally abused. This intersects with PTSD, where we certainly see that men have a greater propensity for PTSD if they've had a history of childhood abuse. We also see, importantly, binge drinking by men. And what we see here is certainly that both for men and women, really high prevalence of intimate partner violence that women disclose, and men themselves disclose really high levels of intimate partner violence.
Shanaaz, we've lost your presentation. I'm not sure what's happened.
You've lost my presentation.
Yeah, I don't know if it's other ones. I'm just seeing like a Windows screen in front of us. I don't know if it's just me or.
So shall I just end and then I'll restart my presentation? Would that work? Because you're losing the gist of what I'm wanting to say if I don't have my presentation up.
Okay. Do you want to try that? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just re-share my screen.
Okay.
Oh, I see what's happened. How long ago did you lose?
Like literally like 5 seconds.
Okay,
so there we
all right.
Yeah, so
can you see my screen?
I can see your screen if you just want to go into presenter mode.
Is that showing now?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So just thinking about shared social norms, what we do know is mothers who are subjected to abuse by their partners are more likely to use physical punishment against their own children. We also know that normalization of violent and controlling forms of masculinities were found to drive gender inequality, inequitable social norms. And I've spoken about this a little bit before, but boys' experience of abuse during childhood certainly shape their belief systems and actions and increases their likelihood of perpetrating IPV as adults. So the culture of silence within families themselves perpetuate violence from happening, and therefore reporting isn't, reporting, we find that is a barrier to reporting and health-seeking behavior. And all of this we see drives an intergenerational cycle of violence where exposure to intimate partner violence in the home has negative consequences, firstly on the child's health, development and well-being. What we also know is that violent discipline and exposure to intimate partner violence, both against women during their childhood, appears to increase their risk of violence during adulthood, both as victims and perpetrators. And what we see from the multi-country study that was from the Fulu study is that men who experience childhood violence, including corporal punishment, were more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence. And men who are exposed to childhood trauma are then at increased risk for IPV perpetration. We know that women are also at increased risk of experiencing both physical and or sexual IPV in adulthood. And just drawing on my own research, what we do see is that men spoke about being scared of their father's violence, particularly in relation to their mothers, and most men speak about severe punishment during childhood. And often these forms of punishment are not seen as abuse, but normalized in terms of how to rear children. And these severe beatings impacted severely on men's self-esteem. And men spoke about being punished by their mothers as well, being framed in the context of discipline. So it's not just father's use of violence, but as well as mother's use of violence. So turning to prevention, what we do know is that violence in the home is complex, and there's no single factor that explains the prevalence of violence in households, but that there is an interrelated web of factors that are at play and underpin and drive what we then see as violence within the household. We have seen the emergence of two frameworks over the past 5 years or so, driven by WHO, the INSPIRE framework for children and respect for women, and in many ways they overlap, so they're not very different in what they're promoting as strategies to prevent both violence against women and children. And in terms of our review, we looked at programs that have potential to be making a difference in terms of both violence against women and violence against children. So it is about being able to address the intersections. And what we found was that there were 5 main strategies that emerged, and I'm going to talk briefly about each strategy. So one of the main strategies that emerge as successful in terms of, and has great potential in terms of addressing both violence against women and children, is that of changing social norms, where community mobilization and an activism approach to change community attitudes and norms are certainly very successful to shift behaviors and norms around gender and violence. It's important also that it addresses power imbalances, and that programs start addressing gender inequalities that underlie this power imbalances at its core, and that community activism is certainly a central component where communities are involved through group engagements as a mechanism for delivery, and that the focus of these interventions are about transforming ideas around masculinity, violence, as well as has the potential to reduce IPV within the home, as well as violence against children. And we've seen this in programs like SASA from Uganda. The one big challenge is really strengthening child protection and families. And targeting risk factors that increase the risk for violence in the home is certainly, such as poor mental health and alcohol abuse, is really critical. Family level interventions have not really been explored much in South Africa, or there's been limited, I would say, in my opinion, there's been limited investment in looking at family level interventions, firstly to reduce conflict, and then to also create safe spaces for children. Reducing childhood trauma, as I've shown from the intersections work, is that reducing childhood trauma is certainly critical if we're wanting to prevent intergenerational cycles of violence, because it has the potential to reduce later perpetration as well as victimization. What we are seeing from different parts of the world, and a study from Zambia is showing us that a task shifting approach has shown efficacy. So where we're looking at psychosocial interventions to reduce repeated trauma, we see that task shifting approaches have shown efficacy in resource constrained settings to reduce intimate partner violence, which has an effect to reduce overall violence in the family. We're also starting to see the emergence of evidence that there is combining both economic and family strengthening approaches is possible to reduce harsh discipline as well as IPV, and this is work from Burkina Faso that's emerging around the combination of interventions. An area of work where there has been substantial investment is certainly around improving parenting practice. But one of the limitations with this work is that there have not really been a lot of studies that have explicitly explored the potential for it to be reducing violent practices by parents. But what we do know from the emerging evidence is that it is a promising strategy to improve family dynamics and prevent violence against children as well as IPV. And this is work that's being shown in Uganda, and some of the work is emerging in South Africa as well. Parenting programs also certainly have the opportunity to include concepts of gender equality and non-violent forms of discipline, and that's really critical, that it has to be integrated within those programs and not seen as an add-on, but be integrated fully. We have to move beyond just thinking about parenting skills, but as I've said, integrate the work on gender norms. A program in Uganda have shown that including fathers is really critical in those programs, to be starting to think about non-violent forms of discipline by including fathers centrally in those programs. School-based programs have been another area that have emerged as really important in terms of shifting experiences of violence around the intersections, because adolescence is seen as a period of risk. and therefore victimization and perpetration of both violence against women and children has the potential to be reduced if programs are focused during this period. What we have seen through this review is that multifaceted interventions can reduce dating violence, for instance, as well as sexual abuse, targeting learners, educators, and parents. A bit more controversial is work done in Kenya around the use of self-defense training and combining that with self-esteem for young women, young girls, and challenging ideas of masculinity among boys. It's showing some promise, but it requires further investigation. So it's really critical that we start thinking around what are the protective factors that we need to strengthen in order to reduce experiences of violence, both within adolescence and then later on as well, in order for us to reduce the rate of sexual assault, particularly amongst adolescent girls. I just want to talk about economic strengthening for a moment, because I think it's really important, because a lot of work have been invested in starting to think about economic strengthening interventions targeting both girls and women. And it shows promise to reduce violence against women and violence against children. But there's been quite a bit of critique around the strategy itself and what the causal relationship between the economic strengthening intervention is, and whether in fact it directly has an effect on experience of violence, and whether there are other mitigating factors within that's rather causing. So for instance, what we're seeing with Creating Futures in KwaZulu-Natal, that rigorously evaluated an adaptation of the Stepping Stones project, is that you see a reduction in violent behavior by young men, but not women's experiences of violence. So young women's experience of violence does not change. And I think it requires further investigation before we start saying and seeing economic strengthening as the silver bullet. So in conclusions, what are some of the lessons that we're learning from this area of work is that multi-component intervention certainly has better success in achieving improved and sustained outcomes. We also see that adolescence is possibly an important period to target these complex pathways and intersecting risks associated with violence against women and violence against children. But importantly, what we are seeing is that we've got to see violence as not a once-off incident, that it occurs across the life course, and therefore interventions have to take this into account. We see that community-based interventions that combine gender equitable norms and parenting or family strengthening approaches certainly has the potential to reduce intergenerational effects of violence. But I want to end off by saying what we are seeing in these very rigorously evaluated programs is merely a starting point, because rolling out or adapting programs for different settings does mean that you've got to consider how to adapt and then implement. So implementation matters for programs to be taken to scale and really have to be given quite serious thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanaaz. That was a really comprehensive and informative and detailed presentation. I think you covered a lot of territory, but in a very accessible way in the time that you had. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Felix Bwalya. Felix, are you able to hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to share your screen? Also, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, I know you're with Partnership for Prevention, but if you could maybe just give a bit more detail about yourself, and then you can jump into your presentation, and then we'll take comments and questions thereafter. So over to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Felix Bwalya. I'm working in Zambia on a flagship that is focusing on work with religious and traditional leaders in preventing violence against women and girls. I'm not sure if my...
Your presentation is showing, but it's showing office regulation. It's a different one, maybe. That's not the thing you want to share.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll just start because I have the presentation.
There we go. There's your presentation. We can see it now. If you wanted to maybe put into presentation mode. There we go. Perfect.
There you go. Right.
Fantastic.
Okay. So from Zambia, like I said, and this is sharing interventions that have happened in the southern part of Zambia, focusing on the 3 districts of Monze, Choma, and Livingstone. That's the little outline. And just to mention that the most form of violence experienced in Zambia is intimate partner violence. That is reflected in here that mostly about half of the people, women, actually have experienced that. In the rationale for us to go into this intervention, one is that Zambians are notoriously religious. Despite Zambia being declared as a Christian nation, we have nearly or close to 99% of the population affiliating with one religion or another. And that already outlines the influence that the religious leaders have on the population. Secondly, we also experience what you call dual legal system in Zambia, where the customary law as well as statutory law seem to be at par. Only when there's a conflict does statutory law take a lead. And that puts then our traditional leadership also in authority and with greater influence on the people. Now, despite the influence that both the traditional and the religious leaders have, we've noticed that they haven't been sufficiently engaged in as far as prevention of gender-based violence is concerned. We also note that the 2 sectors have divergent views with respect to violence against women and girls, which sometimes are very contradictory and in other cases also misleading. To note also is that our religious leaders are at different levels of skills in as far as theological understanding is concerned, with some of them actually sharing scriptures, very literal, that in itself seem to be perpetuating violence against women and girls. In like manner, we see our traditional leadership, some of them not very schooled in traditional matters, and therefore don't seem to understand very well their culture. And with that, they interpret it mostly to suit themselves on the expense of gender equality. So that's the objective of this particular flagship, that we wanted to work with the religious and traditional actors to reduce the acceptance of gender-based violence. And we anchored this on contextual issue study, commonly known as the contextual biblical study. We tweaked this to become issue study because we were working with traditional leaders as well, whose major focus is on dialogue and consensus building, and it starts with the mapping, but with the aim to spreading the word on prevention of gender-based violence. So if we zero in into the mapping, it brought to light the very fact that we have traditional and religious leaders in terms of their geographical location and what they are able to do. It also outlined their perceived gender norms, some of the roles that they play in there, and the various forms of gender-based violence that are occurring within their setting. It also outlined the bigger gap that we have in as far as power imbalance is concerned. Like most of our chiefs are males, very, very few females actually ascend to hierarchies within the churches. And the area we are intervening in is a farming area where polygamy is also highly practiced. But it was realized that most of these men indulge into polygamous marriages, not for love, but to increase their labor force. The more women they marry, the more laborers they have in their fields. And so males are perceived then to be provided of caring for the children. Find it hard to find a place where they will be able to keep their children. So most of the times then they leave their children with perpetrators, and therefore increasing the risk of their children to be involved or to be victims of violence. Men were also noted to be spending most of their earnings outside their family setup, Then dowry was a huge problem because in this particular setting is exorbitantly charged, and the males who are paying for dowry tend to interpret this as if they are buying the person that they want to marry. And with that, then they tend to also abuse the women that they marry because they have an understanding that they own them by virtue of paying these exorbitant prices that are charged on dowry. The other problem is fundamentalism. So from the religious point of view, some of our religious leaders are interpreting scriptures very literally, and with it then also carrying out messages that seem to be perpetuating violence. Same with our traditional leaders that don't understand fully their cultures. There's been levels of misinterpretation and ultimately also fueling violence in those areas. So the steps taken now into the contextual biblical study, or what we took to be the contextual issue study, was we started with a trainer of trainers, which was a 5 days training. We had gone into the religious and traditional actors within our catchment, asked them to second some people that can be contributing their time and are available to participate in this. The inclusion criteria we looked at was one who is committed, respect other people's views, who can facilitate, willing to learn, but also is a role model within their society. And so we also indicated to them that they should make sure that when they are sending participants, half of the participants should be female. But unfortunately, only 5 were female from the 18 that were sent to participate in this TOT. So once the training was done, also we realized that it was heavily on biblical passages because it was a contextual biblical study. So we took time then to tweak it so that it's very adaptable and user-friendly to our traditional leadership. We also spent time to work with our facilitators to ensure that they are supported in their facilitation skills, because most of them, this was like a very new approach, different from the previous ones that they used to interpret scripture from the literal point of view, therefore needing more time for them to be assisted with these skills. Once that was done, we went back to our traditional leadership and religious leaders, informed them about what the program will be happening, and requested them to also now add up 2 representatives from each chiefdom and 2 representatives from each church motherboards to be participants in the dialogue sessions that were forthcoming. We had initially planned for 4 blocks of dialogue sessions, and each block was 4 days straight in the conversations. On the first block of the dialogues, we had invited people from the Victim Support Unit to present on the legal framework as far as GBV is concerned. Now, that was a very controversial kind of conversation because it also brought to light the different controversies that they had between the police and the traditional leaders as well as the religious leaders in there. At the same time, it was a very healthy conversation because it allowed people to understand or increase their knowledge in as far as GBV is concerned. It also ironed out misunderstandings that they had with the police. Some of them were misconceptions that they had with the police, but also helped them understand the challenges that the police faces in failing to respond to some of these demands that they placed before them. It bridged rivalry that was there between the traditional leaders and the religious leaders. At the same time, it also opened up the referral mechanism that was within that setting. With that done, the representative or participants of the workshop came to choose one issue that they wanted to focus on, and they all agreed on marriage. With that done, we split the groups into 2, traditional leaders on one side and the religious leaders on the other side, and ask them now to look at how they can anchor that issue within their respectable specialization. So for the religious leaders, they went to such scripture passages that they use for marriages, as well as the traditional leaders looked at whatever production that has been produced or what they could remember, stories or narrations from their culture that speak into marriage. Then there was a guide in as far as how they were going to interrogate this particular topic. So we further divided the groupings to ensure that there is very good conversations in there, so that is a maximum of 8 per group. And then within the guideline, they were to look at this particular passage, for example, from what we are calling in the front, where the one become aware of the baggage they come with when they're coming to read, in this instance, for example, of the scripture passage. So when they read the scripture passages, what memories is it bringing to them? Experiences that they've had in the past that sometimes get to blur the reading in this particular scripture, or that influence the understanding of this passage that they are reading. And then another level was to look at the literal composition of the passage that they're looking at. So read the passage several times to understand what the passage is saying in itself, but also to understand how they interpreted that particular passage by the community to which it was written to. The third level was looking at behind the text, that is taking into consideration the social, cultural, and historical context within which this particular text was written. And that involved consulting the biblical scholars or looking into the gurus and the sage that may be knowledgeable about what was happening at that particular time. Now, having looked at these 3 stages, we come back now to look at the community that is sitting or reading that particular passage in the here and now, and ask ourselves the question of what relevance has this passage got to us? What meaning do we want to carry for ourselves now? And what do we want to do about this? So that done, we had finished in the first block of the roundtable discussions. They went back to report to their chiefs and the high-ranking officers within the religious setting, and then got feedback. Then we came to the second block of the roundtable discussion, where we incorporated the feedback that was coming from the people that they were representing, then asked the religious leaders to start formulating sermon guides, so that they are now giving it a flavor on how best can they interpret scripture with a lens that is gender sensitive, but at the same time that is closer to being very theological in as far as the interpretation is concerned. And then the traditional leaders took a draft in composing what we are calling a position paper, so that they take a stance in as far as on what do they want to be known for, or what are they standing at, given this issue that they've been able to interrogate with the questioning, the different guides that they had in questioning and answering it. Once that was done, again, they went back to report to their representatives and came back for a third block, in which we introduced the trainings on gender transformative approaches and feminist theology. For the religious leaders, they participated in the feminism theology, and that was also mind-blowing for most of our religious leaders being males. Some of them self-proclaimed ministers who don't have any theological background, but it was very appreciated in the end. The gender transformative approaches were exposed to both the religious and traditional leaders. Again, that was another mind-blowing issue, especially for our traditional leaders who may have one traffic way of looking at issues, but eventually it brought about very good conversations. Then with that done, the traditional and religious leaders came up with a joint position paper in terms of what now their stance is jointly. And then we invited now the chiefs and the high-ranking officers within the church motherboards to come and append their signatures as testimony to this is what they're going to stand for. So that done, then the next step was they should be held accountable to what they've signed for, and be the people now that start spreading the news in line with matters that they've signed for. But for the traditional leaders, we are going a step ahead now to start looking into the bylaws that exist within the locality and influence reformulation of those bylaws in the light of the position paper. The church leadership are using the sermon guides every time that they're going to be preaching sermons during weddings to ensure that they are being, engendered and being gender sensitive in their talks. As a matter of recommendation, we wanted to propose that this shouldn't be a rushed process, because it's mind-blowing and like it's a new area for most of these people. So it requires a lot of time for them to start digesting and appreciate the new approach that is coming on board. And I'm sure we are all aware how patriarchal our societies are, whereas our traditional leadership as well as the church leadership, that still requires a lot of time to give way for power balances. So when inviting for these meetings, there should be deliberate policy that they should be forced to ensure that there is more participation from the women folk. And one way of doing that is we shouldn't restrict participation to just a hierarchy, but you can deliberately look at the different settings within which that they have many women participating in them. And we also want to recall that trainings like gender transformation shouldn't happen at the beginning of the roundtable conversation, but maybe halfway through, because then in the beginning, people are not too sure of who is calling out for these meetings, but only halfway through that they get to trust you and they can be able to respect these innovations that are coming in from the gender point of view. I also wanted to mention that we had an input on what we are calling the African worldview, as well as the two worldviews. This was very helpful in helping our participants realize how much influence the missionaries had or still have, especially on our religious actors. The missionaries came into these settings without fully understanding the traditional concept and therefore condemned everything that was tradition. And unfortunately, a couple of our religious leaders still hold that kind of view. I recall in the earlier meetings that we had, the picture that most of our religious leaders had was that they are coming to convert our traditional leaders to become Christians. And that brought a lot of rife. But with this presentation on one world view as well as two world, it helps them understand the different vital and good practices that are in both settings, the traditional leadership as well as in the Christian settings, and appreciating and valuing some of these things that are very good, not forgetting, swatting away some of these things that may be very bad. And also wanted to bring out the fact that facilitational role is very cardinal in such settings, because you'll be talking to people who are highly opinionated. You may also have some of them who come in with a baggage of disappointments that they may have had. For example, we have traditional leaders who are excommunicated in some of these churches. And so this can be like a breeding ground for fights if not well handled. So it's very cardinal that facilitators who are taking a lead in these meetings are being attentive to some of these things. Yeah, and like I said, to be aware of what could have been the past experiences could be emerging in these conversations, and to ensure that you're paying attention to make sure that those that don't take and spoil the conversations that are happening in there. Thanks. That will be the end of the presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Felix. That was a really interesting presentation. It's not often that you hear about the use of kind of a religious focus for crime and violence prevention. So we have about 25 minutes left. So I want to open up the session for, sorry, if someone can just turn off their mics if they've got it on. I'm just getting some feedback on here. All right, so we have about 25 minutes to have any comments or questions. I want you to, if you have any questions or comments, to please use the raise the hand function. For in terms of the control panel, for those not familiar with Microsoft Teams, it usually sits at the top of your screen. There should be a sort of a smiley emoji face with a hand next to it. If you just hover your mouse over that, and you'll see the hand symbol there, you just click on that if you want to raise your hand. If you're having problems with that, then just go to the chat function and just type raise hand, and then we can give you an opportunity there as well. So I'd now like to open the floor for any comments or questions. I see Lizo Kagwe, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to give you an opportunity. We're going to take a few questions and comments first, and then give the speakers a chance to respond to those, and then we can take a few more questions after that. So, okay, so I lost a hand there. Is it Lizo? Did you want to speak or not?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
okay. So
I wanted to speak.
Okay, so just keep your hand up until you have spoken. Otherwise, I'll lose you on my list of more than 50 people at the moment. Okay, Lizo, you're first, and then I've got Mtungoza after that. Okay, so Lizo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, to the two presenters. I really, although I joined a little bit later, but I really enjoyed the two presentations. But I want to comment on the first one. I'm always worried when we use training of girls in combat trainings. To me, it seems like we are shifting the blame now. We are saying you are being bullied because you are girls, and boys are bullying because they are boys. Violence begets violence. I don't think it's wise for us to even think of using violence like your training in karate, boxing, whatever, as a way of mitigating the violence that is being perpetrated by boys. That's the only thing that I wanted to raise. But I saw that on the research that they've done, it has kind of reduced the incidence of violence against girls. But we must always remember that violence in our communities has always been a very, very highlighted things. We see violence in our TVs. We see violence outside. Even the comedies, the Popeye, what do you call this for children? They also use a lot of violence. I think violence should be kind of cut off in all our interventions so that people can understand that violence in actual fact doesn't really solve the problems. That was just my observation on the first one, or my comment on the first one. The second one, I'm really pleased that the presenter also touched on the issues of irreligion and culture within our communities. True. When we go into our communities, we need to understand exactly where these things are coming from so that we are able to inform them about the latest ways of how to interpret even the scriptures that we grew up with. I really appreciate that, but it really resonated with my way of thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We've got 4 other hands that are up, so we're going to take these other 4 questions.
Hello, Program Director.
Yes, hello.
I'm very sorry. I'm a BBLT, born long before technology. I've been trying to raise my hand. I am unable to do so. I would request that I be recognized once the speakers have spoken. My name is Poppy Muchumi.
Okay, Poppy, we will add you as number 5 on the list. So after Ziwen, so you will speak. So I've got a list of 4 people in front of me, and Poppy, you'll be number 5. And then what we will do is we will have an opportunity for the speakers to respond. Okay, so next on my list, I've got Ntongoza. Please excuse my pronunciation of your name. Over to you.
No, that was perfect, Chairperson. Mine goes to, in fact, first of all, I'd want to thank the two facilitators that for the well-articulated presentations and that are very informative. My question or my concern goes to the second facilitator. I realize that there is talk of 2 main groups that were involved in the project that they had, which is religious leaders and traditional leaders. My concern there is that does this not have implications for the marginalized groups, like the groups that are in the minority or the groups that are being affected by this violence, that they are not being brought to the table when matters of formulating strategies of preventing violence are actually being formulated? It's concerning to me, especially in the light of violence being normalized within societies, and then if they are not equipped with the knowledge that actually violence is not right, will this not have implications on their ability to actually then come out of violent situations in instances where they are able to? Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you. Those good comments. Jennifer Downs, you're next on the list. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. Thanks to both speakers. That was they were beautiful presentations. I really appreciated the second presentation, the impactful community work that's going on with the traditional and religious leaders. And I had two questions just to ask a few more details about how that's happening. So first question, once the traditional leaders have formulated this position paper, is there a way that they also take the message back to their communities, or is their focus really on affecting the laws, as the speaker was saying? But how do those traditional leaders bring some of these mind-blowing thoughts back to the people in their communities? And especially the second question, how does this reach people that aren't going to hear the sermons in the churches? And is there a way that traditional leaders or other leaders in communities can have a wider reach? Thank you.
Thanks. Next on my list, I have Mike Batley. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Guy. I also want to add my appreciation to the two presentations. Really fascinating and excellently done. Thank you. I'm from the Restorative Justice Centre in Pretoria. And over the years, we have done quite a bit of victim offender mediation, victim offender dialogue in gender-based violence cases, with getting referrals from the courts. Now, that remains controversial. We've got a new small project that started up recently, battling to get referrals. But there has been quite a bit of literature coming out, I think mainly from Europe more recently, that does demonstrate the validity of it and the impact of it. I haven't seen anything from more locally or Africa generally. So I was wondering if the facilitator or the presenters could comment on that. In my own thinking, it would seem to fit into that first intervention of changing social norms, because I think it diffuses an incident and also provides the platform for learning new ways of dealing with difference and conflict. So from that perspective, it would seem to be self-evident that it would be a useful intervention. So if you could just comment on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. We're just collecting questions and comments at the moment, then we'll open it up for responses. I've got two more on the initial list. I acknowledge, Ronelle, your hand. We're going to give you an opportunity in the second round, but in the first round, we still have two more questions or comments. I've got Ziwen. Excuse me if I mispronounced your name. It's over to you.
Thank you so much for this speech. The presentation was really wonderful. I really appreciate that. So I'm mostly working for GBV problem in China and the Middle East. So I don't really know much about Africa, and that's why I came to listen to the webinar today. And I really wanted to ask two questions. The first one is that when we talk about gender-based violence and any kind of violence, we always kind of focus mainly on the physical violence. But I kind of want to know that if the community of practice were any of the organization that's working for any other form of violence, let's say the social violence, the mental violence, and this kind of thing that's more invisible compared to the physical violence that we know. And then the second one, it's also that I'm working right now towards the religious law in the Middle East, and I'm curious that in Africa, and especially in South Africa, if there's any law or let's say religious association, religious institution that actually published something to protect gender-based violence. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then last person for this round of questions is Poppy. So over to you, Poppy, and Ronelle, we'll take you in the next round. So Poppy, your question or comment, please.
Thanks, Program Director. Let me first thank whoever invited me to this virtual meeting, and also thank both the two presenters. As it has been indicated, my name is Poppy Muchumi, here in South Africa, and I mainly focus, my main focus on the rise of persons with disabilities, women in particular. And I listened through both presentations. Let me say, yes, we agree as a disability sector that you, as a person, you might be a woman, or you might be a child, or you might be a boy. So you might fall in any of those categories in terms of the gender or in terms of the age. But then women with disabilities face more challenges in terms of gender-based violence. And it's not only gender-based violence. As the speaker has alluded, we have a number of abuse of violence that is perpetrated, that is not visual, against women with disabilities. And this has been evident predominantly during this period of the pandemic, where we find with women with disabilities, some rely on other people for assistance and for survival. And the very people are the very ones that perpetrate those atrocities against them. And there's no mention of that category of human beings in both presentations. And whatever challenge, my view is always that whatever challenge that you want to address, and you leave persons with disabilities or women with disabilities outside of your preparations of whatever plan that you have, you will never achieve your objective, simply because there's no way that persons and women in particular with disabilities will be like dinosaurs. They will never be extinct. They are in this planet to stay. At times, I always make this joke that when presenters make presentation or prepare for their presentations, they don't want to mention the word disabilities because they are scared that probably they think that disability is contagious. So once they mention the word, they'll become disabled themselves. And let me allay your fears, it's not the case. But however, non-disability is not guaranteed. You are only guaranteed that you are non-disabled when you are dead, when you are at the mortuary, or when you are in a coffin. Because I'm speaking right now, okay, I'm disabled, but presenters have been presenting, but it might happen that when they leave, wherever they are, they can become disabled. You sleep, tomorrow you may wake up being disabled. So that's my concern. There's a mention of religious leaders. Zambia mentioned that their workings with religious leaders and traditional leaders. My comment will be on traditional leaders. We know that in rural areas predominantly, our first point of call when we have to report, even before going to police station, is our traditional leaders. And we know how difficult it is when you get to most traditional leaders, when women with disabilities have been violated, have to go and report their cases to the traditional leaders. So that's my concern. I would go on and on and on when I deal with issues of disability, because this is very close to my heart. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Poppy. That's bringing up some very important points there. I'd now like to hand back to our two speakers and give them an opportunity to respond to those comments and questions. And hopefully we have a few more minutes at the end to give Ronelle and maybe another couple of people a chance. But so I'm going to hand back to Shanaaz and give you an opportunity to respond. And then Felix, I'll give you an opportunity after that. So Shanaaz, over to you. You're muted, Shanaaz. There we go.
Yeah, a number of the responses was really around the second presentation, but Lisa, you asked specifically about the training of girls in combat, and when I spoke about it, you've got to remember that what we did was, and the methodology for this was that we looked only at published literature, right? And what the published literature has shown about effectiveness of programs. I indicated when I had spoken about the training of girls in relation to combat and building of self-esteem that it is controversial. So I don't necessarily support the idea of training girls for self-defense, but I'm presenting what is the latest evidence around what is showing to be effective. And I think the important part is it's not necessarily about the teaching girls how to defend themselves, but it is about building self-esteem as well. So it is about the other components that's showing the importance. So the program is currently being rolled out quite widely across different countries in Africa. So I can communicate with you directly. I can give you my email and I can send you some of the literature regarding the program. And you can speak to the program designers yourself. But as I said, there has been criticisms, and I myself think it's quite controversial. So I would agree with you totally. The second question was from Mike around restorative justice and whether it could be used as a process for changing social norms. I think it's certainly, we don't have documented mechanisms of restorative justice and the use for violence prevention. My understanding of violence prevention would be that one would have to think very carefully about using restorative justice mechanisms, because you also have to be thinking of what is the protection mechanism within that. So for instance, if you're thinking of violence against children, restorative justice doesn't always protect children in that regard, because often what happens is if you're looking at using a restorative justice approach and you have something like sexual abuse of a child, which often happens. So what we are finding in other work that we've done is that, that there are ways that communities are dealing with sexual abuse of children, where they have been dealing with it in a more restorative way, where families are paid in rural parts of South Africa for damages, and it's not taken through the court system. But that in itself is very limiting, because what you're doing in that way, so you've got to think of restorative justice within a very different way, where you're also thinking of child protection, also thinking of whether you're moving forward in terms of creating the change that's desired, because doing restorative justice, having mechanisms like that in place can work, but only if you have it as part of broader mechanisms of change and thinking of how you're wanting to integrate shifting norms and doing more norms work within that space. But I'd be very hesitant when we're talking of protection work where there's real forms of violence experience, that you can't just use restorative justice approaches, that it has to be a combination. And then Zubin asked about physical violence and whether religion in South Africa, and I'm not, as far as I am familiar with how religion and whether there's policies and different religious groupings, my understanding, and Guy, you might be able to help out here, but most of our religious groupings adhere to what's in the Constitution and our rule of law, and therefore buy into the kind of policies and legislation we have in place, and would have to abide with it as well. So there's no dual system in South Africa. So our domestic violence legislation, our legislation on sexual assault are all binding for everyone. And if religious groupings are not adhering to it, they themselves can be taken to court. So Guy, I don't know, because we do have, for instance, mandatory reporting around sexual abuse of children, and any religious leader would have to, they're mandated to report. Guy, I don't know what your take on, whether you have
absolutely.
a different...
Absolutely, I agree completely. It's, some organizations may feel that they're beholden to their own set of rules, but the Constitution and the national legislation kind of holds true here. So, I mean, you're absolutely right, Shanaaz. Shanaaz, can I give Felix a chance to respond, because we've only got about 5-6 minutes left.
No, I'm done, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Shanaaz. Felix, can I hand over to you for your responses to the questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. So I'll start by saying there is realization of rurality being very correspondent actually with high levels of violence. And also the realization that most of the people that you are highly going to get in touch with are the religious and traditional leaders, because they are the ones who are reaching out to most of these areas that the police are not in our setting. So the decision to work with the police, to work with the religious and traditional actors was one, like I said, because everybody has respect for these two sectors. Our country, 99% of it are religious, and we all are practicing a dual-legal system in here. In the absence of the police in rural areas, the traditional leaders sit and judge some of these cases. And there's been a misunderstanding because it clearly states out what sort of cases the traditional leaders are able to sit over or to preside over. But because of distances in as far as the nearest police station is concerned, most of these cases end up being judged by the traditional leadership. So a sitting like the one we did and bring in people from the police to come and speak about legal matters helped to iron out some of these misunderstandings. Now, once we have come up with this position paper, the idea has been that the traditional leaders go back into their communities, sensitize their catchment areas so that they are all in the knowing on what this position paper is or what their stance is. And it would hold two ways. One would be then the traditional leaders are held responsible for what they have signed up for. For example, if they have said that there is no underage marriage, what used to happen in the past is, traditionally speaking, there wasn't an age cap for a child to be married off. Constitution speaking, from a statutory point of view, it says you can't marry but below the age of 18. Traditionally speaking, they didn't have any age band. So they were looking at maturity that could come with the onset of menses. But with the position paper, we've ensured that they tie up the age that is linked to the statutory law. Now, with that done, then there is no traditional leaders going to give an excuse to say they didn't know. You know, they're not going to follow issues like they used to do before, that once a child, attains their menses, then they can marry them out. So it makes them be responsible over what they've been able to sign up for. At the same time, the people that they are governing get to know also what their rights are. So parents then will be educated to say, you can't marry your child out, because both from the traditional point of view, we are condemning it, as well as statutory point of view is also condemned. So we are in a way bridging the two laws that in some point has been seemingly contradictory. So there will be sensitization then to the communities so that they are in the knowing on what is composed in this position paper. The same way with the sermon guides, they'll also be disseminated to the people so that they know, at least have an idea on what's the correct interpretation of the scripture. The famous scripture used in weddings where it says, women, submit to your husbands, that have been literally been taken and, like I say, been misinterpreted on the expense of our women. There will be a little line on what that really means. And so our hope will be that our religious leaders, when they get hold of these copies, they'll prepare their sermons in light of what the theological interpretation is, but also being aware of what the gender lens is. But also the listeners who will have a copy of that sermon guide, if they were to meet some religious leaders who, for one reason or another, are not able to comply to these things, on their own, they will be educated to say, well, that's not how we are supposed to be interpreting scripture, because not every word in the Bible is to be taken literally. So yeah, there'll be massive, can I say, sensitization into the communities. We are not just talking about physical violence in here, we are also alive to the fact that there are other forms of gender-based violence. And so in our conversations, that also was brought to light. I hope I've answered all the questions. If not, please let me know which ones I still need to get back to. Yeah,
I think you have. I mean, there were a lot of comments and questions that were thrown at you.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Sorry, so the program director, my questions are not being responded to. I indicated that whatever that you want to do, for instance, let me go to Shanaaz's presentation where she mentioned that out of every 2 women, one has experienced either physical or sexual violence. But then I'm asking, of this 1:2 or 2:1, how many of disabled women did they come across? Because as I say, whatever policy that you want to come up with, as long as you leave these people out, the disabled women, your objective will never be achieved, because at no point will these people become extinct. They are here to stay, which means in whatever that you do, you must ensure that they are also included. You have made your presentation, not a single word, let alone a sentence, was mentioned about women with disabilities, whom I indicated that they are more exposed to violence than their counter or their fellow non-disabled women. And nothing has been said about them in this presentation. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Poppy. Just to jump to a couple of our presenters' defenses.
Can I respond? Yes,
Yeah,
I'd like to respond, because I'd like for Poppy to note that this is not primary research. We didn't go out and ask women. We've used what research is available. It's a scoping review, so we've used information out there. It's not that we're silencing disabled women, but that is where the gap is in our published literature. And I think what Poppy should be advocating for is that it be put on the agenda, particularly of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, to have an explicit focus on research on disabled women and its intersections with femicide and gender-based violence, because there is a big gap in our knowledge. And most recently, there has been work done by the South African Medical Research Council, but none of it is national prevalence work. So, Poppy, I understand your frustration, but we've used what is out in the published domain and can only report on what is in published literature, unfortunately.
Thanks, Shanaaz. Felix, do you want to come in on that issue?
Yeah, I also wanted to say, yes, we are alive also to the fact that we have people who are differently abled. And so it's in the publication of these documents that we have to be mindful of, the reach that he has to go to. Yeah, so thanks for still bringing that out.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Ronelle, I'm sorry we didn't give you an opportunity to ask your question, but we are over time and I need to be respectful of that. So I'm going to have to bring this webinar to an end, unfortunately. But we do have, the kind of our presenters out there, and they'll allow us to share their presentations, I hope, to anyone who's out there. But also, please, for those who have further interests and want to engage with our presenters, I'm sure they would be open to engaging by email if they have the time. But yeah, since we're past 2 o'clock, I really need to thank our two presenters, Felix and Shanaaz, for making the time to be here and making time to give really interesting and informative presentations. I'd also like to thank GIZ for generously providing funding to make these webinars possible, and thank my colleague Lauren October, who has been responsible for putting this particular webinar together. So I'd like to thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and please do join us every Friday, because we will be having a different webinar and a different topic relating to violence prevention, crime prevention. So thanks, everyone, and have a good afternoon and a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
How do we know? Hello, I'm not sure if you're still on. Hello? Hello? Exactly. And I'm sure once I go to the fire, so they must just tell people because some people who want to no one of my yes, that is the problem. Money to explain for you so much to explain million. Why you being an action, what is their account? Saturday when they knew what is working and whether I'm at the I think it is always for